COCO was housed here from 63 to 65. It was renovated or restored in 2008 through 2011. We had our grand opening in 2011. I'm Rico Chapman, the academic director here at COCO. I also teach in the Department of History and Philosophy. And we would like to thank you for coming out to this program, celebrating the life of Aaron Henry. Aaron Henry was the president of COCO in 1962. So we are definitely standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is also a very sacred space, as you know, and you can tell by the pictures you see. Some of our exhibits on the walls, and we have exhibit space across the hall also. So this is very, very important to us to continue the mission of the original COCO and continue that legacy that Aaron Henry and others in the civil rights movement, such as Edwin King, Reverend Edwin King, who's on the panel today, they have laid the groundwork. They have put in the work. They have blazed the trail, so it's much easier for us to walk it now. So we would just like to welcome you and thank you for coming out. I want to turn the mic over to our moderator for this evening, Professor Rhonda Cooper. She's a clinical assistant professor and pre-law advisor in the Department of Political Science at Jackson State. And please get your questions ready. Open your ears, and I think you'll learn a lot tonight. So welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Before we start, I'd like to just say I see some of my political science students here, and those that I do see have had to participate in research and essays concerning the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So I think they are very glad to be here and have the opportunity to learn even more about that party and the work that was done in the 60s and the 70s. I would like to introduce our speakers this evening. We will start with Mr. Derek Johnson. After completing law school at South Texas College of Law in Houston in 1997, Mr. Johnson joined the staff of Southern Echo, Inc., a nonprofit organization located here in Jackson. Serving as the regional organizer for Southern Echo, Mr. Johnson provided legal, technical, and training support for communities within 6 states across the South: Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, and South Carolina. He has provided redistricting services to municipal and county governments across the state of Mississippi. Currently, Mr. Johnson serves as the president of the Mississippi NAACP State Conference and member of the NAACP National Board of Directors. In 2007, Mr. Johnson successfully managed the Jackson Public School District Bond Referendum campaign that brought $150 million in renovation and new schools to the Jackson area. In response to the Hurricane Katrina devastation in Mississippi, he was appointed to serve as vice chair of the Governor's Commission for Recovery, Rebuilding, and Renewal, and has become a leading voice for the equitable rebuilding for the working poor in the aftermath of the hurricane. Mr. Derek Johnson. Reverend Ed King, a native of Mississippi, was a major figure in the civil rights movement here in this state. In the 1960s, Reverend King and his wife Jeanette returned to the state from the north, and King began working as chaplain at Tougaloo College, a predominantly black school here in Jackson. A Methodist clergyman, Reverend King was denied membership to the white Mississippi Methodist Conference due to his liberal racial views. The black Mississippi Methodist Conference, however, accepted him as their only white member. Reverend King was a key leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and in the 1963 Freedom Vote mock campaign and election, he ran for lieutenant governor, and Aaron Henry, president of the Mississippi NAACP at that time, ran for governor. In 1966, Reverend King unsuccessfully challenged John Bell Williams in the Mississippi Democratic primary for the position of 3rd District Congressman. King has also served as one of the MFDP's delegates to the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago and has helped found the Mississippi Civil Liberties Union. Reverend Ed King. Morrison is currently professor and head of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Mississippi State University, where he is also Senior Associate in African American Studies. He was previously the Frederick Middle Bush Professor of Political Science at the University of Missouri in Columbia from 2005 to 2008. He held the position of Professor of Political Science at Missouri from 1989 to 2009. Dr. Morrison held the position of Vice Provost for Minority Affairs and Faculty Development there from 1989 to 1997. Prior to holding these positions at Missouri, Dr. Morrison was Associate Professor of Afro-American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University, where he served as Chair of Afro-American Studies for 5 years. Before joining the faculty at Syracuse, he was at Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York, and Toulouse College here in Mississippi, where he was involved in various political science, freshman studies, Third World Studies, and African and Afro-American Studies and curriculum. Dr. Casey Morrison. And before we begin with our discussion, I would like to recognize the family of Mr. Aaron Henry and his grandson. Aaron Henry is present. Mr. Henry? We'll begin our discussion this evening, and we will allow Mr. King, Reverend King, who worked very closely with Mr. Henry in the 1960s, to please share with us this movement that spawned the Mississippi Project. Dr. King?
I think the movement that spawned it is 350 years of struggle for freedom. And people looked at what was needed and then what was possible and then said, well, nevertheless, what will we attempt? So it was a matter of what can we try next? Am I seeing a great-grandson of Aaron being held up back there?
Great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter. Well, I'm 40 years younger than Aaron, and I didn't meet him until 1970.
Okay.
No. I met Aaron in the 1950s.
Okay.
I have grandchildren. So I wasn't expecting quite my contemporaries to have great grandchildren.
Okay.
Congratulations. I want to start, but I didn't realize anybody from the family would be here to tell the rest of you that Aaron is almost a Jacksonian. We talk about him as somebody from Clarksdale, and that's certainly the focus of his career. The last 30 years he spent in Jackson, in the legislature, negotiating and so on, and he helped set up COFO so that civil rights groups, local groups throughout the state, and new groups like SNCC and CORE and SCLC could cooperate so this building comes. So he was constantly in Jackson, but his wife Noelle is from a Jackson family, and Aaron and Noelle are buried here in Jackson. Now, I'm a teacher as well as a priest, as well as an agitator and a storyteller. How many of you knew that Aaron was buried here in Jackson? Well, yeah, okay. We lose our history very rapidly. And there is an important cemetery right next door here, which could have become a parking lot. That has happened all over America, all over the world. We're putting up historical markers now, and that's good. But you will be taught as students to look into books and read and to watch the television documentaries and things like that. I want to refer to a few books in a moment. I was watching a television documentary last night that I thought would be satisfactory, that I'd get upset tonight. They're doing 4 hours on JFK, and we'll start at 7 o'clock. You have to go to it. It's not as accurate as you might think, so you might stay here. At the end of that program, they showed, this is PBS, they showed the presidential campaign of 1960. Well, the sit-in started in February of 1960. long before the Democratic campaign got hot. So we in the movement were watching the presidential candidates. We later came to moderately support, even admire Kennedy, but we didn't trust him. And we didn't trust Richard Nixon on the other side, and we didn't trust the establishment. We learned by being burned by the establishment that that was okay, but we were suspicious. Things were said in that film last night about the family money. Well, family money still seems to matter in American politics. But they talked about Kennedy's father's money helping buy delegates and helping in elections in Wisconsin and West Virginia, and managed to slide over what we all talked about at the time, which I firmly believe, that it wasn't just a matter of, buying some local pol who was chairman of a county. If that didn't work, you turned to the poor side of the organized labor unions, and you got a turnout, and you got to vote no matter how you needed to get it. That's just the way American politics worked. No hint of that. I thought of telling my granddaughters to watch this, and you'll learn. And be careful when they get down to the assassination, because that's going to be propaganda that there was no problem. We all know the answers to that. But the problem started last night. And then the final thing on it, they had Kennedy elected as president in this close election. They did a good job with Dr. King. And Dr. King was arrested in Georgia and sent off in the middle of the night, 100 miles or so to the state prison. And Mrs. King was obviously very worried. And someone advised John Kennedy not to take a stand on what was happening, very carefully, not to take a stand, but just to telephone his sympathy to Mrs. King, which he did. And that was enough to get his father, a prominent Republican black leader, Daddy King, immediately endorsed Kennedy for president. And the black vote was very significant in 5, maybe 6 states. And it became a real power on the national scene. Then sort of visible in 48 with Harry Truman, but became very important there around the new symbolism of the movement. And they show the election the last few hours, trying to decide, and then they say the next morning Kennedy is announced as president. And there had been a close vote in 5 or 6 states, including Texas and Illinois. Well, as a minister...
I'm sorry, Reverend King, was that something that you and Mr. Henry shared together, and as you were watching
Not with
play
him,
out
but with the state people who
Okay.
came into Mississippi.
Okay.
And we would refer back, that was our learning lesson in national politics
Okay.
for all of us.
And did that set the groundwork for the work that you did the following
Well,
summer?
it set, 4 years later,
Okay.
it set the place that we didn't just sit back as tourists or amateurs, but that there was a place for people in national politics who didn't have to already have leadership positions, and that the forces we were against were so complicated and so powerful that we didn't have to even sit down and try to figure them out. It was a vacuum in which we could move. And I think nationally, as black people began to organize away from Daddy King, who said, this is the way I want people in my church to vote. Well, we in the movement said, no, we don't want the minister telling us how to vote. People themselves should get together and talk. So we saw the things that happened there, and they were in our minds over the next 3 years of organizing in Mississippi. The SNCC came in. Now, the 2 books I want to refer to, one is by Milton Viorst, V-I-O-R-S-T. I hadn't looked at it in years. I did 2 days ago for this. Didn't bring it with me, so I'll have to summarize the quote. And it's On Fire in the Street in the 1960s, and talks about Aaron Henry, Ed King at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. and says that the delegates from Mississippi, who were field hands, farm workers, barbers, beauticians, school teachers, things like this, they were turning down the two-seat thing. I'm not going to go into all the details. And that the president's mistake was offering the 2 seats and naming Aaron Henry and Ed King as the 2 delegates. And he said, and this was a mistake for Lyndon Johnson, because although Henry and King wanted the seats and supported the compromise, untrue. We both were against it from the moment it was mentioned to us, but legend gets built up, TV, even books. We weren't interviewed for that book, but that was a major book on the 60s, and it said that the reason we wanted it and were unacceptable was that we were unlike most Mississippians. He didn't say black and white, but lumped us together, because we had college education, which most of you either have or are striving for. Aaron would say go to it. That we were educated middle-class men who were out of touch with the struggling poor people in the state, had not experienced any of the suffering of the movement, and had no experience in organizing.
Well, can you share with the audience what some of the experiences and struggles that you know Mr. Henry may have had in bringing about the
Mr.
changes that we
Henry was
experienced?
involved in the struggles from the time he was in college at Xavier in New Orleans, studying to be a pharmacist. That's in the post-war period, late 1940s, early 1950s, along in there. And he was active in student government at Xavier and met with some of the black political leaders in New Orleans. He would talk to me about that, how they weren't sure they wanted a student who wasn't even registered to vote. But he helped organize student government politics. Now, I think Medgar did some of the same kind of things at Alcorn. But Aaron was involved in college politics, student government politics. And then, when an organization of student government leaders from throughout the nation was set up, the National Student Association, organized by Al Lowenstein. Lowenstein came to New Orleans, found out that Aaron wasn't just from New Orleans, but also from Mississippi, and said, you've got to be part of this new national organization, the National Student Association, which represented most of the colleges outside the South. Few black colleges in the South and few white colleges were involved. And people in the nation laughed at the idea, even if you were in the student government, what did that have to do with national politics? But Aaron said, the world is changing. And he joined and was very active in that organization and maintained contacts. That was something else we had to learn in the movement, was to have a network of contacts that you could call on. So in 1963, when Medgar was assassinated, Al Lowenstein received a telephone call from Aaron Henry. You have to come to Mississippi to help. Aaron already had that network because of what he was doing in college, because of his roots.
Reverend King, may I ask a question of Dr. Morrison? Because Dr. Morrison does teach undergraduate students, so I'd just like to find out what Dr. Morrison, or how he has worked the life and the works of Mr. Henry and Mr. Evers into his curriculum as a part of his Afro-American Studies and Political Science.
Well, let me say first that I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all this evening, and to share a panel with what I think of as fellow two balloons, as it were.
Exactly.
Ed started when he babe in swaddling clothes at Toulouse, and I was not yet swaddled. And so, he taught me my first critical course in religion there. I have lived with Aaron Henry, going through his papers and trying to explain his activities in the Mississippi movement for the last 15 years or so. So I have been actively involved in trying to tell that story in addition to teaching. It is not possible, in my view, to describe the civil rights movement in the United States, that movement that can be dated arbitrarily to the time that King and the Montgomery bus boycott started. Of course, there were activities leading up to that, but if we date it arbitrarily from that point in time, it's impossible to teach the civil rights movement without teaching Mississippi's involvement in that movement. And you can't possibly tell Mississippi's story about the importance of that movement without talking about a figure as central as Aaron Henry. And so it figures prominently in all of the teaching I do about the movement as an activity in the southern part of the United States. Mississippi is central to what that movement is in a way that's fundamentally different, I think, than many other places in the South. It was the most difficult territory in which to work. It had the most sustained resistance that was not just people saying, I hate you and I don't like what you were doing, but people who were prepared to kill you and did. And so it's fundamental to understanding the civil rights movement is teaching Mississippi's part in it. Aaron Henry's preparation for the role he played, Ed was just describing the importance of what he did at Xavier University when he's meeting all of these people at a point in time, functioning across race lines in a region where this didn't happen. So when people argue that somehow or other, when Aaron Henry began to try to put together an interracial coalition to break the segregated party in Mississippi, that had just occurred to him, it had long been a part of his imagination and vision, so it didn't just start there. I argue, actually, that it starts in Clarksdale, improbably in a school system that wasn't supposed to have integrity. That there were things happening in those segregated schools that allowed a precocious boy like Aaron Henry to begin to think independently for himself and for being a change agent in Mississippi. So when he goes to the Army, he's already thinking along these lines. When he gets back and goes to Xavier and he bumps into these people from the NAACP, well, he's already a member of the NAACP. He joined in the Army. And he meets some of the important leadership of the organization right there in New Orleans. And then Al Lowenstein comes along with the National Student Association, brings a meeting to New Orleans, and Aaron Henry gets in the thick of it, becomes a student leader in this organization, and this fantastic network that Ed is talking about begins there. And when he had already died by this time, but when I arrived in Clarksdale to begin to study his life and met with his daughter, she talked about the big book that her father had with all of these names of people really quite unimaginable that her father knew, had direct relationships with, and he never forgot anybody. Anybody of importance who could help him to further his goals for social change. He remembered them, recorded them in that book, and that was an IOU from his point of view. He could call on you, and he did with regularity, to have these people engage with him in whatever way that they could. And when a young group of people came into Mississippi early in the 1960s, SNCC, CORE, college students from the North, volunteers who had come down. Aaron Henry is one of the indigenous people who helps to make that path smooth for them. Bob Moses talks about this. So really, in teaching the movement in this country, Mississippi figures prominently.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Reverend King, I would like to ask you, since you are a member of the clergy, would we speak of Mr. Henry as having, or being an ecumenical leader, being able to bring all of the religions and different sects of people together? How did that impact you all's relationship?
Well, our relationship to start with was crossing lines, but he knew when I first met him that I was a friend of Meg's. I first met Aaron in June of '59 on a mission that people would regard as impossible. Our life is full of those. One of my professors in seminary and graduate school was Alan Knight Chalmers, who was president of the Legal Defense Fund. Had been at the time of the Brown decision. And down the street there's an exhibit for Scottsboro, and Dr. Chalmers was president of the Scottsboro Defense Committee, and would teach me how hard it was to get people together as individuals, and would say it's almost like getting Protestants and Catholics and Jews together. Would talk to me about the history of the struggles in New York, where you had political factions, but that you had to do this. No single group could do it alone. There had to be alliances and things like this. In '58, I was 59, I was driving Dr. Chalmers around the state. You mentioned Aaron had a list with all these big names, but most of the big names on that list would not have recognized Anne Seymour or P.W. Steptoe. So Aaron knew, and the very fact that they're in that list is that he knew that they were equal power, and the more networking you could do, the better. Churches do the ecumenical networking.
Okay.
Well,
No, did you have something that you
Yeah,
wanted to add?
Dr. Chalmers went to Clarksdale, and we had a secret meeting that Aaron knew about. I got introduced to Aaron on that trip with one of the top school board members. How many of you think it was one of the black school board members, 1959? Right. But Aaron was the closest thing then. If you were going to talk as a national leader to the school board about what's happening in public school education and what should be the pace of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund push on schools. And Aaron understood that you also had to do things strategically. And Chalmers knew Aaron through NAACP National at that point, and what he knew Medgar. But we met secretly with a member of the white school board who tried to say, look at what all is happening. They were trying to build new facilities for black schools. And Chalmers said, you know, we're going to have to fight that. This is false, and it's not going to work. and you whites know that it's not going to work. Now, Aaron had political sense and courtesy enough not to come to the meeting. Since I was from Vicksburg and not really known, I was allowed to sit in. And Aaron had said they just built a new brick school here in Clarksdale, and they're going to say that takes the place of desegregation. And Aaron told Dr. Chalmers, some of my black friends are so thrilled at getting this new stuff that they will not want to push for more. So here he is analyzing with top national leadership, the head of the Inc. Fund, about strategy. Once we had those contacts, they certainly kept going.
Can I ask, excuse me, Reverend King, I hate to,
Yeah.
I just want to take what you said about working with the school district in Clarksdale and have Mr. Johnson share with the audience how has his work mirrored that of Mr. Henry in bringing about this referendum to bring new schools to the Metro Jackson area.
So, the context for me, the reason why I'm involved in NAACP is because of Rebecca Henry. Aaron Henry's daughter, her sons are in the back. And it was from there I actually got in trouble, and my option was either stay in trouble or start the NAACP. I chose the NAACP. I was speaking to girls' dorm, but so that's the context. And what and so my experience with Dr. Henry was one that came upon me as a surprise because I had no real knowledge of the significance. And so I was at Tougaloo at this time, and I became the state youth president for the NAACP. It was during his last term as state president. And as a result of that, I spent a lot of time with him and James Figgs, our involved in driving around the state. You have an opportunity to listen to the stories, going to Clarksdale, spending time with Miss Noel. Clarksdale was boring back then, I know it was real boring. And out of that, I began to get a real appreciation of what King talked about, the network. But also out of that, I began to get a full understanding of his strategic mind. He was extremely strategic. He was dogmatic. He can be just downright mean to folks sometimes too. But he was very dogmatic about what he went after. And he was very clear about what he seen was right and wrong. And so when you talk about the strategy around school deseg, it really was a strategy that was laid out, not only with him, but Medgar Evers and Gilbert Mason and Winston Hudson, when they looked at how the state of Mississippi had not complied with the Brown decision. And they all set out under this strategy to file lawsuits to force integration, and in some cases, sacrificing their own kids because it was their kids that they entered into those schools. Rebecca was the child in Clarksdale that integrated the Clarksdale Public School, and even when she got older, she talked about the traumatic experience that of that process. But in Clarksdale, with the lawsuit, it was in the Northern District of Mississippi, and the other three suits were in the Southern District. Medgar Evers and Reverend R.T. Smith filed the lawsuit here in Jackson. Winston and W. Hudson filed the lawsuit in Lee County, and Gilbert Mason filed the lawsuit down in Biloxi and Harrison County, and Dr. Henry filed it in Clarksdale. And so the remedies were different because they were in different districts. So in Clarksdale, the remedy was to draw school boundary lines that there was truly the other side of the tracks. Most of the black folks lived in a defined area. I say on one side of the tracks with a few on the white side. And so they can say we draw school boundary lines, and so happened maybe 3-4 families lived on the white side of the tracks, and that was their quote integration. But he continued to challenge that. And as we look at the educational landscape today, it was a result of those lawsuits and that strategic approach that Dr. Mason and Dr. Henry took. When you look at today's educational system, because they were dogmatic in their approach to ensure that all children had a quality education, the response from the white community was the creation of segregated private academies. And as a result of the creation of those segregated private academies, you could almost track that time period when after the Holmes County decision, where all schools had to immediately integrate that anywhere you find that the black student population was between 25 and 30% African American, you will find a segregated academy. And so when you look at Jackson Public School District or many other places, when you see the establishment of private academy, you see a withdrawal of business support from public education. You see a process of limiting taxes to support the infrastructure of the fiscal plan and the supplemental pay of public education. So over time, we found that in the city of Jackson, where there was, and still is, a dire need to renovate many of the buildings, to infuse it with capital so we can have quality teachers and ways in which we can maximize quality education. So much of the work we do today is directly related to what was started then. In fact, if you look at the history of Africans in this country, particularly in Mississippi, it's all a continuum. There is no start and stop point of the civil rights movement. It's a continuum. Dr. Henry was a part of individuals who, it cut me off because I could talk longer. He was a part of a group of men who fought in World War II, come home and could not appreciate the freedoms they had fought for. But they came home not to a blank slate. There was a Dr. T.M.R. Howard, who was a medical doctor in Mount Bayou, who had created an organization. He was umbrella. And those individuals, M.Z. Moore, Steptoe, C.C. Bryant, many others, they were World War II veterans. But they also operated through another system. It was called M.W. Stringer Lodge. Many of these same individuals were members of their local lodges. Dr. Howard was their mentor. They looked up to him. Medgar Evers ended up working for Dr. Howard. When it was time for the NAACP, when they made the decision to establish a paid field secretary of Mississippi, they agreed that Medgar was going to be the person. And this was an ongoing dialogue. And this is not just in the Delta. This is on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, all the way up to the top of the state. And they always talked. And they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have 55. I mean, so it wasn't an easy task. And then when you fast forward, and once they were able to pull a coup to get rid of the state president, C.R. Darden from Meridian, who was wasn't always the nicest person in the world in terms of civil rights approaches, and Aaron Henry became the state president. And Ella Baker came up with a great concept of using young people to recruit them because they were willing to go an extra yard. And they didn't have mortgages, they didn't have families, so they were willing to fight a little bit more. And so when she recruited Bob Moses to come to Mississippi, she sent Bob Moses to meet with Aaron and Amzie, who recognized that in Bolivar County, Amzie Moore had a program. And Aaron Henry had an ongoing project in Clarksdale, but C.C. Bryant needed more support down in Pike County. But it was through that network that, a bunch of Freedom Summer, you're talking about SNCC, but SNCC would not have existed without that network of mature individuals who were the individuals in those communities that kept the community together. And so as Bob came down and worked under Mr. Steptoe and C.C. Bryant, and more SNCC folks would get recruited, Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes. They then got assigned to other NAACP mature individuals who was courageous enough to maintain an infrastructure, but they respected that those young students were courageous enough to go and try to register people to vote. So as you see the SNCC folks come in, all of them were assigned to these men and later women, Winston Hudson, because she was as rough as any of them, because if you go up in there at night, you would get shot by her. They were not non-violent folks. Non-violent was only a tactic, but at many of the meetings and demonstrations, they had guns too. And so let's understand that non-violent, as it was discussed, was only a tactic because they understood you could not call for all-out war because they would have been outgunned and people would have been slaughtered. But they were very clear of defending themselves. When they went to burn Turnbull's house, Mr. Turnbull's house in Holmes County, 2 people got killed. Turnbull shot them. It was only reported the next day that there was a hunting accident. And these guys was killed in a hunting accident. because they were trespassing on his land when they burned his house. Vernon then was shooting back. That's how his family got saved. So Aaron Henry comes out of that type of struggle. Constance Curry describes him as a conservative revolutionary because he understood that you had to operate on multiple levels to move democracy forward. And this was about African Americans in the state of Mississippi being treated equal under the law and having the right to exercise their franchise and allow democracy to work for them like they did everyone else.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. So Reverend King, when we talk about the courage of Dr. Henry and this conservative revolutionary ideology, can you share with us the magnitude of you all's testimony before the Credentials Committee at the 1964 convention?
Well, that's another good example of very careful planning, of networking, of sitting down for days before we had the testimony with the lawyer, which 5 points have to be gotten in, but who do we have to reach from the Senate in California, and how can that be said? How can we do something about Minnesota, and who will do it and how? Right on down to our speeches were basically written in advance and shared with each other, except for our big power, Mrs. Hamer.
Exactly.
But we prepared, and most of you have seen I think most of you have seen some of the film of Mrs. Hamer. There's a photograph in the back of Mrs. Hamer at the convention in a big flowery dress. We knew that she would make the personal, emotional appeal. Now, I've been with Aaron when he had an audience screaming and cheering and crying, and I could do that to an audience too. But we had something else to do, and we had to very much show that Aaron is like a respectable political leader in the United States, whatever you think of this Hamer woman. We had Rita Schwerner, the widow, to speak. And my task was to outline some of the violence that Rita, and we would have 2 white people talking about the violence, she who had lost her husband, and I had almost lost my life several times. But Aaron was the key strategist, not the lawyer. He respected the lawyer, but in putting it all together, again, it was Aaron. I just hate to see him insulted in some of these books.
Yeah, well, and if you look carefully at these minutes of meetings, for example, of the organization of COFO, you know, there is now a literature that suggests he had no fundamental importance on the ground in those meetings, and you just gotta go to the minutes. It's all in there.
He didn't have to be to his credit out front. It's in the minutes because he wanted organized and structured.
Exactly. And it's
And never claimed the credit.
It's the organization and the detail that he's given to that, and he certainly never ever was grandstanding, glory seeker kind of person, and he had every right to be, given his importance to what developed, especially after his murder. But he is always grounded, has this capacity to negotiate other people's fears, jealousies, and conflicts, and so on. There was Aaron, who was able to put it together, pull people together, and have them to see this focus that was just sustaining for him. It was remarkable. The focus he had from day one. People argue that day one is different from day 5. They're not paying very careful attention to what he's saying. All along, he is one of the steadiest individuals in terms of vision throughout this whole period. He's steadfast, doesn't waver. He could be hardline, when he needed to be, but he could also recognize when people's concerns about their turf and so on were getting in the way. He is the person who could level that out and made him an incredibly important strategist for the movement. And that's something that we don't get enough credit for.
And that's the continuum that Mr. Johnson spoke of,
Exactly.
that Dr. Henry knew from day one to the last day what his objectives were for the people of Mississippi and for the country, for democracy. I would like for us to open it up to questions. Is that okay, gentlemen? Are we ready to field some questions? You're going to entertain questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask Mr. King more about when you use the strategy to have the mock vote with Mr. Henry. Just more about that process.
Well, we had over 2 years of work with SNCC volunteers for the most part, but also CORE and FCLC through COFO. We had probably tried to register 90 to 100,000 people, and we had a 95% failure rate. That was not failure of the people. They had stood up with enormous courage. That was failure to pass the test. What we had to document to the nation was that black people in Mississippi wanted to vote. The 2 years we were doing the registration drives, coordinated by Aaron as COFO leader, we would try to reach people in Congress. I mentioned like Minnesota or California that we were talking about at the convention. Many of the white Americans, good middle-class folks, would say, well, what's wrong with a person having to be literate? You don't have to be literate in Iowa, but what's wrong with that? If the people of Mississippi want it, well, I would say, well, but it's only the white people of Mississippi that said they wanted it, and people wouldn't know what I was talking about. You'd have to break in. We had to bring over America. We were told in Congress that it doesn't matter what I think, a senator would say, or a congressman. What matters is what my constituents think. And they believe black people are happy. The governor of Mississippi, of Alabama, and so on, but particularly Mississippi, said any black person who wants to register to vote, who is literate, can. Well, we had to tear this down. He said, the people are not interested. Well, we didn't have 90,000 people on the 4th of July in 1962, which would have been very visible. This 90,000 people was 5 or 6 at a time. If you got up to 10, you might be arrested for demonstrating. If you went in 2, you'd be fired from your jobs. So we realized we've got the numbers, but how do we dramatize it? How do we really show? The parallel myth was the governor would say, black people are not, they'd say colored, are happy in their place in Mississippi, and why don't you people in the rest of the nation leave us alone because everybody's satisfied. We had to show, and not through a few individual martyrs in a few counties, but in a big way. And we talked for many months about how to do that. After Medgar's death, in June, we were at the bottom. Would we give up? If we did anything, would we make life worse for the local people? Would more local people be killed now that the leader had been killed? In August of '63, we came up with the idea of using those counties where we could get a number of people together on one day, Clarksdale, Holmes County, Greenwood a little, but particularly Hines County. And we knew everybody that had tried and failed. And we found through research, student law researchers usually, that if you were denied the right to vote, you had a right to cast a challenge ballot. So we brought people, we bring them in and get them to do challenge ballots. People were pretty afraid of that, but we got people in a few counties. And then to get real interest in educated people, we decided to run a few local candidates, sheriff and so on. So Aaron ran in Coahoma County for office. R.L.T. Smith ran here in Hines County. And it was important to have a few names so it wasn't just, I wish I could choose between the white Republican and the white Democrat. But all of this is tiny meeting after tiny meeting, often in this very room. How do we do this? We had over 10,000 people come out at that moment, but we got lost in the publicity. Some of our best friends pulled off a stunt, and we lost the publicity. And that was called I Have a Dream at the March on Washington. we had thought in July and August, early on, right up until nobody thought the march would be that successful. We thought all the publicity would focus on Clarksdale, Hines, and 10,000 people couldn't vote or voted in a separate election when they were turned away and chose black candidates. That worked, so we decided in the fall of '63 to expand that. And get Aaron's the idea, and Aaron's thinking of national support he can get from money and ideas and things like that. But that's how it developed.
Thank you, Reverend King. Yes, ma'am.
This question is for Dr. Morrison. I know you talked about the conservative, I think it's conservative ideology that Mr. Henry adopted. Could you just explain that a little bit more?
Well, it's a terminology that one author who has written about him has used, and it's a provocative term, really. What she really wants to draw attention to is that a person of this stature, an educated man who has a profession that he could have done all of his life as an entrepreneur and to have taken care of his family and lived a good life, and yet a person like that, with all of those elements that would suggest a conservative perspective, was a man who could be so radical in support of social change that ultimately it becomes his profession to change Mississippi. He'd been a pretty good pharmacist, you know, he made lots of drugs for lots of people to keep them healthy and so on. But eventually, the movement activity and the commitment to that kind of social change overwhelmed all the rest, and it became his life. So a person with that kind of qualification, and a man who, precisely I think because he is a Mississippian of the age he is, who knows all the rules of how to survive in a racist society, knows all the rules about that, never accepts them, but yet he is able to strategically move around them, through them, to make the changes he makes. An example here is this meeting that gets orchestrated in Clarksdale with the Inc. Fund chairman who is visiting the state and ends up talking to a member of the white school board. Well, Aaron Henry knew all of these people in Clarksdale, would stand up and tell them exactly what he thought. All along, they knew where he stood, and yet he didn't ever suggest to to them that because they had a position different from his, that he had to push them into the sea. His purpose, his platform, was to convince them of the rightness of his position. And if they ever came around to it, he would work with them too. And so it is in that kind of convoluted sort of context in which Connie Curry uses that. Constance Curry, actually, she has, Aaron Henry wrote a substantial part of his own autobiography. It only goes up to 1963, I think it is. A fragmentary autobiography, which Connie Curry later publishes, brings to print. It's published by the University of Mississippi Press. In that book, at the end of it, where Aaron Henry ends in telling his own story, she interviews a number of people, including his daughter, Rebecca, other people who worked with him closely, and it's in that back part of it during that commentary where people are commenting on working with him, where one gets that. And that's a part of his life that he didn't tell himself, figures very prominently in the work that I've been doing in the last 15 years.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I've heard a lot about him being chained to a garbage truck or picking up paper. Are you familiar with that story from King?
He was arrested, and several thousand people were arrested here in '63. After Medgar's death, he was arrested, and to humiliate him in the city and discredit him in the black community, they made him pick up garbage. And I don't think he was chained to the truck, but he would have been in handcuffs when they brought him up there and made him start work. And Gandhi, Medgar, Aaron later told me, Gandhi would have loved it if the British had made him go out with the untouchables and the poorest of the poor to humiliate him. It would have just, Aaron said it was a political triumph.
In fact, there's a spectacular photograph of him on the chain gang, actually at the garbage truck, where he's just grinning with absolute relish, because he knows that this martyrs him in the community, their most prominent leader, reduced to this. If he didn't have sympathy then, by God, he got it by the time he got off that
Okay,
truck.
well, let's remember the other side, and Aaron could always remember 4 or 5 other sides. The white power structure in Clarksdale knew that black people were struggling to hold what little they had. This was a heavy thing when students went to jail for Tougaloo, or I helped with sit-ins in 1960. The students who went to jail were ruining their family's chance. First time somebody's going to be middle class and naked. To be in poor people's clothing was a disgrace to some black people. And if I'm wrong, they'll tell me. But Aaron understood this. And he always dressed nicely. But there were these class distinctions that had to be broken through. And he could never have thought anything this good. They did this to him to say who among the black leaders, and they would have named a dozen people that they thought were the black leaders in Coahoma County. And the rest didn't matter. And they would have said, The school principal's gonna be insulted. He's not gonna want to work with a garbage collector. The minister of XYZ church is gonna be embarrassed if that garbage collector prisoner comes in. Thank God the black community had begun to change, and Aaron knew it, and white idiots didn't.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit about his involvement with his involvement with the regional council of Negro leadership, and even his relationship with the national NAACP?
Mr. Johnson, can you address that maybe initially?
So to start with the last one first, the National NAACP, he was as prominent a member of the National Board of Directors as anyone in the history. He never aspired to be chairman of the board because he didn't have to. He was positioned well enough that no matter who was the chairman of the board, they had to come through him. When I first started going to national conventions and national board meetings, it became extremely obvious. Even today, I mean, his legacy on the board was really transferred to Fred Banks, who's the longest serving member of the board. Is when Judge Banks speak, everybody listen type deal. When Aaron spoke, everybody listened. And it was interesting because he was a part of the group who kind of democratized NAACP. It was for many years an exclusive club in New York, and to be on a national board, you had to be of a certain status. And over time, there were different movements, iterations of movements to try to make the organization more of a democracy, so more voices can be heard and participate in the decision making. And Aaron oftentimes was on the forefront or somewhere behind the scenes making that move. So people say, well, the board is too big, it's 64 members. But if you understand, it went from a small board that was centralized in New York to the complaint of folks that was not enough representation across the country. So then they created regional seats so you can have regional representation. They said, well, we don't have any youth seats, so they created 7 youth seats. And you see how it begins to grow. And Dr. Henry was always in the midst of that type of movement. You know, the unique thing about the NAACP, it is a small D democracy. And because he had participated in the mock vote, in Freedom Summer, he rebuilt the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. He knew how to play that game perhaps better than anybody else. And as a result of all of those experiences, when you get to an institution like the NAACP, if you understand how democracy works, you can run the organization. And he did that very effectively.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Well, the Regional Council of Negro Leadership is one of those important early organizations where many of these individuals in the Delta, and this provides an opportunity for us to talk about the Delta as a special place and a special case in Mississippi's movement. You may have noticed that a number of these names of prominent people that we've been calling over and over again, Henry, Hamzy Moore, and so on, are veterans who are operating in the Delta. And they get to know each other. They are a part of this organization. If you've ever read the history of the United Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's organization that in the 20s had these big bombastic parades in Harlem where black people were marching and asking for rights and so on, and this particular kind of nationalist strain that Garvey had developed. If you don't know the story of these meetings of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership that was organizing mass meetings like that in the Delta, it was located in Mount Bayou, a community where African Americans had independence, but it wasn't the only place they met. They went down on the Gulf Coast where there would be hundreds of African Americans having a mass movement where they're talking about things like voting rights. Well, in this organization, all of these men in the Delta, and they're men in this moment. There are women who are developing in other spheres, so when things get really active in the early 1960s, there are women playing major roles. At this moment, they are men in this organization. Aaron Henry meets T.R.M. Howard when he gets back from Xavier and starts his pharmacy. There was a natural connection between his clientele in Clarksdale and the medical facility that Dr. Howard has established in Mound Bayou. This is where African Americans are going for health care if they need a hospital, for example, in the Delta, where they are all members of this regional council. And Aaron Henry very early takes a leadership role in that organization. If you look at some of the documents from there, you see the names recurring over and over again of these specimen in the Delta, almost all of whom are veterans, who have come back, having seen a different world, having fought for their country, and to come back and to discover that they don't own it. It's not a discovery, really, but they arrive with a new attitude about what they don't own, but feel they have to come to possess. And this organization is an important piece of that. There is a new biography of T.R.M. Howard by Beito, B-E-I-T-O and B-E-I-T-O. What's it called? Yeah, Black Maverick, it's called. That recounts this organization.
So, oh, I'm sorry. So, I mean.
Ed, you may, what did you,
Right.
you may want to say something about the regional council. I know, did you know Dr. Howard, for example?
I would know about Dr. Howard from interracial meetings between Millsaps College, Tougaloo, and Aaron sometimes came to those. Medgar, that's where I first met Medgar. But Medgar would ask me, did I want to do sociology and history papers, and come to his office, and he would help. And several of us students did, but I learned about Dr. Howard and knew who he was, assumed that he was threatened, was not shocked when he had to leave the state. I think the shock probably to him and the people in the Delta was that he lived that long.
Yeah. Given what he was
But that somebody might have to run was also acceptable behavior. No, Medgar would say that. Medgar did not run because he knew, when he talked to me, he knew he was so visible. He could survive. He would say Aaron could survive anywhere in the country. Merle and Medgar had college backgrounds, could survive. They had to stay. Dr. Howard was not quite that kind of a person, and it was all right. I think if Aaron had told Medgar, this is something we should try to stop, it wouldn't have happened. I don't think either one of them, they respected Howard, wanted to, and I certainly knew about what was going on. And I was never invited to speak at the White Methodist Church in Bolivar County, nor in Mount Bayou at those meetings. Aaron would have said, one day,
but not this day.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Thank you, Reverend King.
Yes, ma'am. This question is for Mr. Johnson. You stated earlier that the youth back then did not have mortgages and families, so they were willing to fight. Considering, and you also mentioned that the movement is a continuous process. Given your history working with Ben Jealous and the Ayers case and starting at an early age, just like Mr. Henry, where do you think we're headed when it comes to continuous mobilization of the youth? Do you think we have that same momentum?
Much of the youth movement was not based on momentum as much as it was on strategic planning and critical thinking. The youth didn't wake up one morning and said, we're going to do this. You had an individual, or individuals plural, was particularly Ella Baker, who had gone through several iterations of organization. She started off NAACP nationally created our youth and college division, or youth division at that time, and that wasn't a good fit for her. And she kind of went, did some more stuff and began to do some stuff with the SCLC and realized that it was the same show with men there too. So she moved on from there. But she understood, she had this theory that in order to bring about some change, you had to get some movement in the streets. You had to get young people engaged, because if you think about Aaron Henry and Amzie Moore owned the gas station. Aaron Henry had a pharmacist, they had families, they had responsibility, and it was only but so many of those type men who had the luxury of disposable income and time to get engaged in this stuff. Most men and women at the time, they didn't have the luxury of disposable income or time. But young college students specifically, and young people generally, they did. And so as that group of individuals began to think through, how to push back. You had the graduates like Thurgood Marshall, who didn't believe in any protest in the street. He felt that everything could be done in the courthouse. But then you had master strategists like Barry Rushton and Ella Baker, who conceived of a really good idea. Why don't we get young people engaged? And so through that strategic thinking, and almost a fluke in Mississippi, when they said Bob Moses, who was 25 and considered old by the young activists, when they sent him to Pike County, it was almost like a fluke that the kids walked out of school, which allowed for them to step in and use that energy and begin to help support that energy. And then after that, when some of those students ended up at Tougaloo, and that was a safe haven, it gave that opportunity to have those type of critical discussions. If we didn't have the president of Tougaloo at the time that allowed for that type of free thought and create that safe haven, we may not have had a youth movement as we know it in Mississippi. We didn't have a Medgar Evers who bought into the philosophy, despite what Gloucester Clark was telling him he could not do, to support the youth council to do certain things. We may not have had that, but the young people didn't wake up one day and say, this is what I'm going to do. So when you talk about the Ayers case, it was interesting because it was an NAACP convention, 92, in Indianapolis, that I went to go check in my room, and Alvin Chambers is in my room, because they put him in my room because he didn't have a room. And I get there, and he just finished having this argument before the Supreme Court about equal funding for Jackson State, Valley, and Alcorn. And in that, you have all these lawyers coming in and out the room, and I'm sitting, I'm listening, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting. But Alvin was frustrated because he had just gone to the Supreme Court, and he made the argument, he made this comment, he said, if young folks don't take to the street, we're going to lose black colleges as we know it. And I'm like, whoa, and that was coinciding with the time that Dr. Shakira at Tougaloo was telling us, I can't raise money if y'all ain't protesting. And so here I got a college president telling me and two of my friends, we got to protest so he can raise money for the school. And then I'm sitting here listening to this lawyer who just argued a case before the Supreme Court, me who had never been a black lawyer prior to that, probably become a Mississippi, for that matter. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting. So we get back on campus, let's create something. And what was unique, where Dr. Hooks did not want us to pursue this course, Dr. Henry said, y'all do what y'all need to do. Let me know what y'all need. Because for him, it was that forward thinking. Now, Dr. Hooks and Dr. Henry were close friends. Dr. Henry helped Dr. Hooks make a whole lot of money in business. Right? He put him on his TV board, put him on his Job Corps board, a bunch of stuff. But their philosophies were different. I mean, Dr. Hooks was a profound speaker. He was a motivator. Dr. Henry was a strategist. And so I had been in a meeting with him with Ingalls when the black workers were complaining, the longshoremen was complaining, And Eagles wanted to do a check to the NACP. He took the check, he said, now this check don't mean we won't fight you tomorrow. I mean, he was a strategist. And so out of that, we were able to create a student movement 92, 93, 94, 95, because you have people around us to say, here's some direction, consider this. And so momentum moving forward, we have to create those safe spaces for young people to critically think, to understand what their role is in making this democracy work, but also understand they have ownership in all of this, that our tax dollars pay for this, that is not the government is in us, we be the government. And we must understand our ownership of that in ways in which, when it's not functioning right, that we must challenge it. And then once we challenge it, we must also begin to understand how to navigate it and control it so it can meet the needs and interests of the communities that we come from.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, very good question, especially about the youth, because I was going to ask, what would Dr. Henry, what kinds of strategies would he present to young people today and involve them in the process? On the other hand, also, how do you keep, how do we maintain and continue with the older adult community? Because there seems to be a void in there somewhere. There is no one leader of the Black people today. There is no one leader, which is something that we were accustomed to. But that strategy will no longer work, I don't think, and I may be wrong. But how do you, given the kinds of problems that we have, especially with healthcare, crime, how do we keep some involvement that will produce outcomes that would be beneficial to Black people? And in terms of some type of, the movement would have to take on another definition, though. It wouldn't be the same movement. But how do you do that using some of the strategies that Dr. Henry utilized during that period?
Yeah, I come from the school that we've never had one Black leader. That has never been the case. The continuing, I mean, if you look at Black First Sojourn right here in Mississippi, I mean, pre Civil War, we've always, that was an informal infrastructure of pushing back. And when Sherman Army came through here, Blacks immediately began to follow the Army, and in many cases picked up arms. And we had contraband camps, contraband because the Black folks were not considered people, therefore property, therefore it was contraband. And those contraband camps were set up, and they were reinforcing Union armies in areas where the Union armies were losing. And so those men and women at this time who were courageous continued to fight. The Constitutional Convention of 1868, right after emancipation, we were there, we were present. It wasn't one person. When you fast forward, during the Reconstruction period, you had individuals like Charles Caldwell who began to fight back the Redeemers and took up arms and began to march from Vicksburg to Jackson. So we've always fought. After that, when the Niagara Movement Call was established, it was M.W. Stringer Lodge who paid for Ida B. Wells to attend that meeting because they want to have a Mississippi voice at that meeting. And it wasn't Ida B. Wells, it was a whole state lodge of individuals who put money to send her. So all those men were leaders. After, so we've always had many folks. It was Dr. Howard who came back to Mount Value, the Black town, because that's a training ground for Harry medical students who also understood that he had another obligation. And it was through that, these mass meetings, be it in Belzone or be it in Mount Value, you had Herbert Lee, you had so many people who were always, you had the bootlegger Chin in Madison County. He was a bootlegger, but he also provided support for the Black community. And so it continues. And I took on as my responsibility, if I want to sit in the seat, I had to understand what the seat meant, not only for me, but for the people that I represent. And so I had to go deep into understanding and always study, said, okay, if in 1964, if the strategy was to open up the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party process determined who the policymakers were, and they created this whole elaborate system. What do I need to do in 2014? Well, we got a problem with education. We have a problem with underfunding of education. There's a validation process. So how do we restructure a scenario where we collect signatures to amend our state constitution to make it a fundamental state right that all children are provided a free public education and make it a requirement to fully fund the formula? So we have to, you know, get out of the routine of I want to be in front of the television or I want to be the speaker and really put some critical thinking. My class I teach at Tougaloo, one of the students in here, he was arguing me all the time. He was wrong all the time. He was arguing me all the time. Because in the class, for me, it was one of Dr. Henry's things when he did with me, it wasn't always about a right and wrong answer, but it's about are you critically thinking through the process? Because we're losing critical thinking skills. Because it is the knee-jerk. I want to be in front of the room or, you know, so I think we have an opportunity. When I sit, you know, with veterans, I just listen. But also, as I have interns who work in my office, the class I teach, the Leadership Institute that we put together, the Black Summit that we have developed, because I understand that whether I'm in this seat or not, we have to continue to expose, and understand that we have a network. And that network has continued through time, decade after decade. If you look at our Head Start system, the founding members of Head Start in Mississippi, they fell primarily in two categories. They were the local branch NAACP president or the head of the local lodge. That didn't happen by mistake because after 64, when everybody started leaving, Aaron Henry stayed here. And he continued to strategize. When the Democratic Party fell apart, him and Claude Ramsey, they came together, they rebuilt it. When Sergeant Schreiber was talking about the poverty programs and about to introduce a bill to create Head Start, he and C.C. Bryant and Charles Young flew to D.C. to say, hey, if you all get us money to Mississippi, poor black kids will see a dime. So Head Start was one of the first programs who got a direct appropriation. Then they strategized and created Head Start programs around the state. It wasn't one, it was several. And that was all through local leadership. And so one of the things that I get frustrated about is we cannot operate from the Jesus complex. It's not one person going to save us because he's in all of us. And so we need to empower as many voices and people with skills and talents to continue to replenish our movement. I talked too long.
Dr. Morrison, do you care to speak to that?
I want to comment on that as well, because I think Derek is absolutely right. Henry's entire public life is an illustration that he did not believe in the single leader notion. From the very beginning, it was his judgment that there were a variety of things to work on. There were a variety of projects, and there was room enough for other people to be working on those projects. And that's why it was easy enough for him to work with SNCC and CORE, SCLC, and with the new NAACP. I don't really have time to talk about this, but I think that what he and Medgar established in Mississippi was a fundamentally new NAACP, and that, you know, you'll have to bring me back another time to jump on that one. The second point is this vision that I've been suggesting that Henry was clear about from day one was something very broad. His project was to acquire regularity for African Americans as members of the political and social community. And that meant education, it meant health, it meant jobs, it meant entrepreneurship. And if you go to Clarksdale, you will see the elements of all of these projects in things that he worked with others to produce in that community. media. If we look in Jackson today, we see the guidelines of that. So it was clear to him that it took more than one person because the landscape was very broad and the challenge was very great. I think one of the things he would say to young people today, or his stance on this would be, I will take you from where you are. If you have ideas and commitment, I can help you to build the strategy. I will support you to achieve what you want to achieve, but you have got to have a vision that's consistent with social change. So he would suggest that wherever you are in the street, however low your pants may be, if you are dedicated to social change, he would be able to meet you there. And the work he did, again, with all of the students who came in here, illustrate that capacity in him. He would privilege young people to do it in their own way, so long as they're being critical and trying to take us to the next place in reference to social change.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Reverend King, would you care to comment? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just want to share with you, I spent a lot of time with Dr. Henry too as a student at Jackson State, and he would tell me that, you know, there are no more scared Negroes in Mississippi, they all left.
You say it like that.
But, you know, I just want to share it with y'all. And also, I went to a solidarity march in Washington, D.C. Dr. Henry had a lot of connections with the labor movement, and he would get labor to pay for buses or whatever we need. He really utilized his connections to support Mississippians. And I just want to say how, I mean, I know we still work closely with labor, but there's just so many challenges that we have now with the voter ID requirement and, you know, the charter schools. It's just, how do we win? I mean, battles we thought we had won, they're resurfacing, and so what's the next step?
Perpetual vigilance. Perpetual vigilance. At one point, it was an examination test to vote. The new examination test is the identity card. So perpetual vigilance.
So, you know, one of the best lessons for Dr. Henry for me was don't be limited, either in your vision, your relationship, or your activities. You know, we would go to DC. We'd go to the Senate, and he would walk in Ted Kennedy's office without an appointment and tell the secretary, is Ted here? Well, do you have a point? No, tell Ted Aaron's here. And they would go, and Ted Kennedy would come out, Aaron, I didn't know you was coming up here, come on in here. It was that broad. He was, in his later years, he was the chairman of the National Commission on the Aging. You know, so, I mean, his relationship, his network is very broad. One of the best lessons that I learned, because if you contain your relationship just to the city of Jackson or the Clarksdale or just to the state of Mississippi, you miss it. Because it's from those relationships that you can pull people, resources, ideals, and apply it where it is needed to apply. And then your vision. Why be limited in your vision of what the possibilities are? You know, I'm of the opinion that the reason why we are having such a reaction from the right is because we're winning, not because we're losing. And because we're winning, we have this Tea Party libertarian type streak that's taking place because they're scared. And if you begin to look at the demographics of Mississippi, you know, you project out, we have won. Now the question is what we're gonna do with it. So the real vision here for me is preparing for once ultimately a coalition of progressive actually take control of policy in this state. Are we ready to really control it? Do we understand it? Can we leverage it? And can we do what we will wish to be done now? Make sure that all the state's citizens are provided for in a way in which is respectful. Because at the end of the day, it is not enough to talk about the problems. And as young scholars, critical thinking is way more than memorizing what to write on a test or how to structure your paper. Because it's through the critical thinking that we do prevail. And that's one of the biggest lessons from Dr. Henry that I could have ever taken. Keep the network broad, be a critical thinking, and look towards what the possibilities are as opposed to get stuck on what you see. Don't allow your view of what you see block your vision of what could be.
Thank you. Reverend King?
I have a minute or so. This can sort of my closing comments on where at that point.
Well, that would be fine. Reverend King, no
The reference to labor, I thought I would be the first to bring in. But Aaron understood the importance of labor unions in the country and that they had struggled, having a very difficult time in the South. In the Freedom Vote in '63, at one of our most critical moments, we got outside help. The outside help of college students from Yale and Stanford is known. Students worked in this building. Students like Franklin Delano Roosevelt III, or working on our press releases in this building, was a student who worked with the Yale Daily News named Lieberman, who later ran for vice president and said his experience in Mississippi was very important. The crisis was not just students, it was money. And the money came from national labor unions. Most of them we would have thought were hostile. We knew Walter Reuther, UAW, and a few others. Late in November, Aaron and I went to New York to give our thanks to some of these labor union supporters. We were there on November 22nd. And this was to be a celebratory event. And we had to speak at a banquet that went ahead, as we were there, with a portrait of John Kennedy draped in black. Well, we felt the loss of Kennedy as a threat to our own lives. The labor people thought that he would come around on labor issues. Aaron understood all of the bridges and mixed feelings at that point. What I missed out on that day was being back at Tuvalu College. When the word came that the president had been shot, it was another half hour or so before the word that he was dead. And in Tuvalu, people gathered in the chapel when any people were arrested in the movement. We'd ring the chapel bell when they were released, and we'd have a freedom rally. People automatically gathered, teachers and students, few televisions, and people were trying to listen on the radio. They were in that room, and an English teacher, Elizabeth Sewell, who literally was English, British, was there. And someone announced that the final word had come from Dallas and that the president was dead. And a scream arose in the room. I talked to many people, and I was chaplain and should have been there, but was with Aaron. People were expressing, Mississippians, all of their fear, all of their grief wrapped up in this one tragedy. And this British woman had never been around a funeral that emotional, had never, even through the Second World War, which she had lived through, people didn't show that kind of fear of the Nazis and that kind of terror and that kind of crime. And this is what she wrote, called The Omens, Tuvalu College, November 22nd, 1963, Mississippi. The cry that drowned the death news, that strange and mortal yell, that was not Southern Negro, but Troy and Israel when they breached the final ramparts and the great city fell. That was not women's weeping, men's groaning prayer. A flock of birds rose screaming through the suddenly thickened air, circled once, took off above us, and took off God knows where. It may be that life goes onward and all can be restored, but instincts, premonitions are not to be ignored. Our city is fallen, 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 and dark wings are abroad in our land.
Thank you, Reverend King. Thank you very much. Dr. Morrison, would you care to make some final comments?
Well, how does one that seems to be the code. I will say, I remember exactly where I was that day, November 22nd. I had not yet arrived at Tougaloo. I was still in high school, and I remember being in my physics class, and the teacher, well, everything stopped, and the teacher comes in and says that Kennedy has been killed, and a cry does go up, and it is as deeply woven in my mind as is the time when we worshiped King.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Mr. Johnson?
I think the biggest lesson of Aaron Henry is perseverance. He persevered through, I don't know where to, now going to Mississippi, but he was a leader who stayed. And through that perseverance, it is unfortunate because he is perhaps one of the greatest civil rights leaders, period. Not just in Mississippi. We celebrate those who gave great speeches. We celebrate those who've done, specific things. But he did a whole bunch of stuff over time, from integrating the Democratic Party not only in Mississippi but nationally, to being owner of one of the first black black TV stations, the first Head Start programs in the country started down the street. I mean, he did so much. If you really dig deep, it blows your mind. But he was humble enough not to try to be the person in front of the camera, and humble enough to understand that it took many, many people, humble enough to understand that the continuum of the struggle for human rights did not start or end with him, but it was his responsibility to build and support others so that continuum will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I think in response to our questions and our presence, our panelists have definitely given us a challenge if we're going to consider and remember Dr. Aaron Henry. One is to be courageous, to persevere, and most definitely to stay the course. But in doing so, we have to be prepared, we have to be organized, we do have to strategize and plan, we must network and maintain those contacts, but more importantly for our scholars, we have to do research and we must be critical and analytical in our thinking. Am I right, gentlemen, if we have to take away anything from our discussion this evening? So I'd like to thank Reverend King, Mr. Derek Johnson, and Dr. Casey Morrison for their time.